What's going on, guys? So I decided to start this video with just a basic disassembly of this block, and that clip was pulled from a video that I had 2 videos ago where I was basically ripping the engine apart, inspecting the internals, making sure everything was good, because I'm aiming for about 800 horsepower on this, but I'll realistically only hit that number with the E85. E85 is not available on the island that I live on, so I will probably get maybe mid 6s. I'm not sure on that yet. Anyway, today I'm going to be assembling the block, measuring the clearances, making sure the clearances are all what they're supposed to be so that the oil can go in and around the bearings and lubricate everything like it's supposed to, so the bearing clearances aren't too tight and they're also not too loose. This video is going to be focusing entirely on the block and assembling that, and I have these pieces laid out here that are going to be going into it. So the Manley pistons and rods are rated to up to about 1,000 horsepower, and pistons are 9.0 to 1 GTE water pump and the GTE oil pump from the Aristo. And then I also have that the Real Street timing belt idler bracket that is a step up from the OEM idler bracket that's known to crack in performance applications. So replacing that stuff, it was kind of pricey, but it's better than having a cracked idler pulley and having to replace that. Everything has been balanced. That's one of the things that I was waiting on when I uploaded the video 2 videos ago. I had dropped the crankshaft off at the machine shop and I was waiting for him to balance everything. So now the crankshaft, flywheel, pistons and rods, they're all balanced. So they're all what they should be. All right, so now on to the assembly of the block and the measuring the clearances and everything. One of the things that I didn't record and won't be included in this video, I want to talk about and just kind of walk you through first, because everything else will be time-lapsed a little bit later, but this I didn't. When I got the crankshaft back, I pulled my original thrust washers out of the block, and I had them sitting there just to keep surface rust developing on the block, and then also to keep surface rust from developing on main cap number 4, where the other thrust washers go, because they go on either side of main cap number 4. So I pulled the thrust washers out, got all the oil off of them by spraying brake clean on, and then put them back in while leaving oil on my main caps so that the crankshaft stays lubricated and it's not sliding on dry bearings. Now, I did that, and I cleaned off the thrust washers so that I could measure without any oil barrier the exact play with the dial indicator. And that number came out to, when I measured this is more for my record if I look back on this video, but when I measured that in play, the original bearings had 4.5 thousandths of an inch. And then I pulled the original bearings out, 190,000 miles on them, I'm not using them. And I ordered King thrust washers. So I put those in, measured the end play again, and then it was 4 thousandths of an inch. And that's within specification. I think the OEM standard for the GTE engine is 0.8 to 8 thousandths of an inch for the thrust washer clearance. And I was right in the middle of that almost. So, and I think the max was 11 thousandths of an inch. But the minimum tolerance was 0.8 to 8 thousandths of an inch. And what that means is, if I take that number and I divide it by 2, I divide it by 2 because there are 2 thrust washers inside the engine. There's one on one side of main cap 4 and there's another one on the other side of main cap 4. And there's a space between that thrust washer and the crankshaft, and that's the space that I'm trying to measure. So if I take that 4.5 thousandths of an inch and I split it in half, when I split it in half, that gives me the gap between each one of those thrust washers and the crankshaft, which in the original thrust washers that were on the engine, it was 2.25 thousandths of an inch. That was the gap that was for the oil to get in and get around the thrust washers and lubricate everything. I measured that so that I could compare it to the King thrust washers that were going in. The King thrust washers were 4 thousandths of an inch, which if you divide that by 2, that's 2 thousandths of an inch gap for each one of the thrust washers between that thrust washer and the crankshaft. And we don't care about the backside of the thrust washer. There is going to be oil back there, but it's not designed to have oil flowing in and out of it. It's just sitting on a little lip in the block. The other side is where the crankshaft would possibly be rubbing against it were there no oil in the engine. If you look at it, it's actually designed to get oil in there and around the bearing. Around one side of the bearing only though. So now that I've done that and I've written down my number for the end play, I will be moving on to using the Plasti-Gauge. And this is, the factory service manual actually recommends using this to measure the clearance. And I picked this one because I'm expecting 2/1000ths of an inch clearance. And you see this measures from 1/1000th of an inch to 3/1000th of an inch. And basically, whenever I put my new bearings in, I'm gonna put little strips of it under each one of the main caps and then torque them down to spec to measure my bearing clearances that are on the crankshaft. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to ensure that my bearing clearances on each one of the crankshaft surfaces, whenever it's bolted down, I want to ensure that those bearing clearances will allow oil to flow through them. And just a quick note on the 10W30 oil that I will be using. That weight of the oil almost directly corresponds to the bearing clearances that are inside of this engine. And I'm running 10W30 because of the new bearing clearances that I'm going to have with the GTE bearings that I'm putting in the engine. Because if you look at the differences between the GE and the GTE factory service manuals, there are slightly different bearing clearances between the two. Now, I ordered GTE parts, but these GTE parts can go in the GE block or the GTE block. It doesn't matter. But since they were sold as a GTE part, not only am I following the oil guidelines from Toyota for the weight of oil to be used in the GTE engine, I'm also using Plasti-Gauge to measure the clearance between each one of the bearings so that I'll know what the clearance is between each one of the bearings. And there's charts online that say, depending on what oil you're using, if it's cold, if it's hot, or if it's very hot, what that minimum bearing clearance is depending on what temperature. So I don't care so much about the cold bearing clearance. What I care more about is the warm bearing clearance, because what I will be doing, just like what everyone should be doing, is letting your engine get up to operating temperature so that you can then drive it and then put load on your engine. So that's a long way to say that basically I'm going to be using 10W30 in the engine because of the bearing clearance that I hopefully will have whenever I install the King bearings and they're all torqued down with the ARP studs. So now the next part of the video is just going to be time lapse, me installing everything, and I'm just going to be doing a little bit of a voiceover explaining everything that I'm doing and why I'm doing what I'm doing. Putting assembly lube on the bearings before the crank goes in, and then putting the main bearings and the main caps, setting them in place before I put the Plasti-Gauge on. So I'm cutting Plasti-Gauge, putting it in place before I tighten the main caps down. And if you're wondering about the torque difference between the OEM main bolts and the ARP main studs, the difference is actually very minimal because the factory main bolts are 33 foot-pounds and then an extra 90 degrees. That 90 degrees adds quite a bit of torque to the main cap, which is pretty close to the same tightness that you would get the ARP main studs to per the ARP specifications, which is 60 foot-pounds. Cleaned off the main caps and putting assembly lube on the main bearings. Now I'm just assembling the pistons and the rods. I actually froze the wrist pin in the freezer so that I could slide it into the piston a little bit easier. Now I'm using the feeler gauge on each one of the piston rings and filing the piston ring down. And then going back to using the feeler gauge and putting the piston ring in the block again over and over and over until I get to the desired gap on the piston rings. Putting the piston rings on the pistons per the specifications that came with the sheet. Each one of the gaps lined up, and now I'm just dropping the piston into the block. Gently tapping with a mallet on a block of wood, cleaning off the top of the piston, pushing the piston down while guiding the rod down where it connects to the crankshaft, and then using Plasti-Gauge again on the rod cap. Taking the rod cap off, checking the bearing space between the rod bearing and the crank, This gap should be a little bit tighter than the main bearing. Installing the oil pump, torquing it to specification. And installing the water pump and torquing it to specification. Both the oil pump and the water pump bolts are torqued to 15 foot-pounds. Now installing the crank rear main seal bracket, and this is torqued to 53 inch-pounds. I had a little bit of difficulty getting my torque wrench in between the block and the engine stand, but it's doable. And with the upper oil pan, the 12mm bolts were torqued to 15 foot-pounds and the 14mm bolts were torqued to 29 foot-pounds. The oil baffle, the 5 bolts and the 2 nuts were all 78 inch-pounds. And then the lower oil pan was also torqued to 78 inch-pounds. These knock sensors are Haltech non-resonant style knock sensors and are not OEM, so I tightened them to 16 foot-pounds, where the OEM knock sensors are actually 33 foot-pounds. And this is very important. And the rest of these things, this coolant tube and also the thermostat housing, I did not torque to specifications. If you've watched this far, for the most part, I've finished assembling the block. My main goal was to put the pistons and the rods in, to gap the piston rings, and to put the lower oil pan and the upper oil pan on. All that stuff is bolted in. I did not mention the gap that I gapped my pistons to, because everyone's pistons are going to be gapped differently depending on their power levels, for one, and also depending on the brand of pistons that are used. They're all going to be gapped differently, and it's not going to be stock specifications. So you'd have to look up your recommended gap for your piston rings. I just have this on top to keep dust and stuff out. Poly mounts, I forget what brand these are. These might be from Drift Motion. I'm not sure. I'll have that popping up. And they're not mounted securely because they still have to be lined up to the frame of the car. This was from the turbo kit that was in. It was already, I just left that there. I haven't taken it out. I haven't removed it because it's not leaking. So that's the drain that I'm going to use. I have the tap, the M6 tap, but what I don't have is the flange to mock up where it would sit whenever it's sitting there. So I didn't want to drill random holes there. I would need the flange in order to mock that up. I had this powder coated crinkle black whenever I had those parts powder coated crinkle black. And the Precision Turbo is also black. It's a Cerakote black. New water pump, new oil pump, nothing really special there, but what I do want to talk about is this is the Real Street timing belt tensioner bracket. I trust Jay's knowledge with the GTEs and the GTE failure points, so I would rather trust his than a copy of his or another company that's just making a billet version that's modeled after the stock, because they've done a lot of testing on GTE stuff in-house, and I have this ready just to pull the pin and like whenever the timing belt goes. Obviously I can't put the timing belt on, and the cover, and I have the fluid amper pulley that's going to go on the front. Everything else is sealed up. And then over on this side, so these are Haltech knock sensors. I think they're made by what's the brand? I'll have the brand popping up, but the torque specification on these, it was in kilograms to force per meter, which was 2.0 to 2.5, so I had to convert that, but that came out to 14.4 to 18 point something foot-pounds. But I torqued them to 16 foot-pounds. I just kind of split the difference and torqued them in the middle. These studs were bought separately. They didn't come with the knock sensor, so I had to buy those studs separately. But these are the non-resonant style, so they're better than the factory style. But they still, just like factory knock sensors, you have to torque them to a certain specification, otherwise they don't work properly. The O-rings for this weren't in my full gasket set that I have over there. So 2 O-rings, there's one that's in between this oil cooler and the whatever oil flow bracket thing, and there's another O-ring that's here. So I'm gonna have to, these aren't tight, they're just sitting in place, which this little washer, it was in the gasket set, but not the O-rings. I would think the O-ring should be in the gasket set instead of this little washer. That's why that's not on. And these are taped off because they're not connected to anything right now. Got to get this little hose because I'm not going to trust just a regular hose to go from there to there. Because if I bend a hose that doesn't have a pre-bend 90 degrees, then it's going to kink. But that's it for this video. Thanks a lot for watching. My main goal in this was not only to use my little slow motion, the little camera dolly. It's a little, it's like a GoPro or a cell phone, so it moves really slow. It's like, I think it took an hour for it to move from one side to the other. But I wanted to use that thing. But also the goal of this video was really to just do a time-lapse build on the block. And I can't do the block and the head at the same time. I could, I guess, but I have a big mess to clean up with everything that I've just left around while I've been focusing on doing camera work. So the next video is going to be the head, and the crinkle black valve cover is going on with the BC 272 cams, the BC valve springs, titanium retainers. I have an old FJ Cruiser engine over there, which it's a V6, same number of valves. I'm hoping a lot of the valve buckets I can use from that one in this, because whenever you're running the larger cams, the shim, you risk the shim coming out from where it sits inside the top of the bucket. And the FJ Cruiser uses the same size buckets, but it uses shim buckets that fit in the 2JZ head. So I'm going to pull all of them out of that and then just sell the parts off of that engine. It has a bunch of engine sludge in it. Hopefully I don't have to order very many valve buckets. Overall, it's coming along. So thanks a lot for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and God bless you guys.